The year is 476 CE, the most powerful empire the world has ever known, an empire that has stood for over 1,000 years, controlling territories from the misty hills of Britain to the scorching deserts of North Africa, from the Atlantic Ocean to the rivers of Mesopotamia, collapses in what seems like a heartbeat of history. Rome, the eternal city, the center of civilization, law, culture, and military might, falls silent. But here's what they don't tell you in school. Rome didn't fall in a day. It didn't collapse because of one battle, one barbarian invasion, or one weak emperor. The truth is far more complex, far more chilling, and far more relevant to our world today than you could ever imagine. Welcome to Neural Battlefields. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's greatest mysteries. What really killed Rome? Was it the barbarians at the gates, economic collapse, political corruption, or something far more insidious that had been eating away at the empire's foundations for centuries? By the end of this video, you'll understand not just how Rome fell, but why every civilization that has ever existed should fear the same fate. Let's begin. To understand Rome's fall, we need to travel back to its golden age, the 2nd century CE, specifically during the reign of the 5 good emperors. Rome at this time was untouchable. The empire stretched across 3 continents, encompassing roughly 5 million square kilometers. Over 70 million people lived under Roman rule. That's about 21% of the world's population at the time. Roman roads connected distant provinces like an ancient internet, facilitating trade, communication, and military movement. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, meant that, for the first time in human history, vast regions of the world experienced unprecedented stability and prosperity. Roman engineering was centuries ahead of its time. They built aqueducts that still stand today, delivering fresh water to cities with a precision that wouldn't be matched until the Industrial Revolution. Their concrete was so advanced that we've only recently figured out how they made it so durable. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Forum, these weren't just buildings. They were statements of eternal power, monuments that screamed Rome will last forever. But here's the first crack in the facade. During the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors, something changed. From 166 to 180 CE, a plague swept through the empire. Historians believe it was either smallpox or measles, brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. This plague, known as the Antonine Plague, killed between 5 and 10 million people. That's up to 10% of the entire empire's population. Imagine that. 1 in every 10 people you knew gone. The plague didn't just kill people. It devastated the economy. Farms were abandoned because there weren't enough workers. Tax revenues plummeted because there weren't enough taxpayers. The military struggled to recruit soldiers because there weren't enough young men. And here's the kicker, this was just the beginning. The empire would face plague after plague, each one weakening it further. The plague of Cyprian in the 250 CE killed up to 5,000 people per day in Rome alone. These weren't just statistics. These were farmers, soldiers, merchants, craftsmen, the very lifeblood of civilization. But disease alone doesn't topple empires. After all, Rome had survived plagues before. No, what made these plagues so devastating was what they revealed. Rome's economy was already showing signs of strain. And this is where things get really interesting, because the economic factors that destroyed Rome sound eerily familiar to problems we face today. Let's talk about money. In the early days of the empire, Roman currency was solid. The denarius, Rome's silver coin, was trusted across the known world. It was the dollar of its time. But starting in the 3rd century, emperors faced a problem. They needed money to pay their armies, fund their building projects, and maintain control. But the empire wasn't generating enough revenue. So what did they do? They debased the currency. They reduced the silver content in coins while keeping the face value the same. It's ancient inflation. Under Emperor Nero in the 60s CE, the denarius was 94% silver. By the time of Emperor Gallienus in 260 CE, it had dropped to just 5% silver. The rest was base metal. Imagine holding a dollar bill and being told it's now only worth 5 cents, but prices haven't changed. That's what Romans experienced. Prices skyrocketed. A measure of wheat that cost half a denarius in the 1st century cost 100 denarii by the 4th century. Hyperinflation gripped the empire. People lost faith in money itself and reverted to barter systems. The sophisticated monetary economy that had made Rome great was crumbling. Emperor Diocletian tried to fix this in 301 CE with his famous edict on maximum prices. He literally published a list of maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services, from bread to haircuts. The penalty for charging more? Death. But you can't legislate economics. The edict failed spectacularly. Goods disappeared from markets as merchants refused to sell at fixed prices. Black markets flourished. The economy went underground. But the money problem was just a symptom of a deeper disease: taxation. To fund the massive military needed to defend the borders, the bureaucracy needed to administer the empire, and the lavish lifestyles of the elite, Rome needed taxes. Lots of them. By the 4th century, taxes had become crushing. The burden fell primarily on the middle class, small farmers and merchants who formed the backbone of Roman society. Large landowners had the political connections to avoid taxes. The poor had nothing to tax, so the middle class was squeezed dry. Here's where it gets dark. Taxes became so unbearable that people abandoned their land and fled to the estates of wealthy landowners, essentially becoming serfs in exchange for protection from tax collectors. Free Roman citizens voluntarily gave up their freedom to escape taxation. Think about that. The very people who should have been defending the empire were running from it. Small farms were consolidated into massive estates owned by the ultra-wealthy, worked by tenant farmers who had no stake in the empire's survival. Sound familiar? The military situation was equally dire. Rome's military power had always been its trump card. The Roman legions were the most disciplined, well-trained, and effective fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries, the army was changing, and not for the better. Recruiting Roman citizens to serve in the legions became increasingly difficult. Why would a farmer leave his struggling land to join the army for low pay when he could barely survive as it was? So Rome turned to barbarians. Now, let's be clear about this term, barbarian. To Romans, it simply meant anyone who wasn't Roman, anyone who didn't speak Latin or Greek and wasn't part of Roman culture. These weren't necessarily uncivilized savages. Many were sophisticated peoples with their own complex societies. Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks had their own laws, traditions, and social structures. But they weren't Roman. Rome began recruiting these foreign warriors in massive numbers. Entire units of the Roman army became composed of barbarian soldiers led by barbarian commanders. By the 4th century, some of the empire's top military positions were held by men who hadn't even been born within Roman territory. The most powerful military commander in the Western Empire in the early 5th century was a man named Stilicho. His father was a Vandal. His loyalty to Rome was real, but his troops. Many of them had more in common with the enemies at the gates than with the Romans they were supposedly defending. This created a bizarre situation. Rome was defending itself with armies that weren't really Roman, and these soldiers had no deep connection to Roman culture or values. They were mercenaries, essentially. When payments stopped or when better opportunities arose, their loyalty evaporated. This would prove catastrophic. The borders were under constant pressure. The Rhine and Danube rivers had long served as the empire's northern frontier. Beyond them lay the vast forests and plains of Germania, home to numerous tribal peoples. For centuries, Rome had maintained control through a combination of military might and diplomacy, playing tribes against each other, bribing chieftains, and demonstrating overwhelming force when necessary. But in the late 4th century, something changed that would set in motion Rome's final crisis. The Huns arrived. These nomadic warriors from the steppes of Central Asia were unlike anything Europeans had encountered. They were superb horsemen and archers who could strike with devastating speed and disappear just as quickly. Starting around 370 CE, the Huns began pushing westward, and the Germanic tribes in their path had two choices: fight the Huns and likely die, or flee into Roman territory. They chose to flee. In 376 CE, the Goths appeared at the Roman border, not as invaders, but as refugees. Tens of thousands of them, maybe as many as 200,000, begged permission to cross the Danube and settle within the empire. They promised to serve in the Roman army in exchange for land and protection. Emperor Valens agreed, seeing an opportunity to gain soldiers without having to recruit and train them. But Roman officials, corrupt and greedy, immediately began exploiting the Goths. They were supposed to be given food and supplies, but officials sold them dog meat at exorbitant prices, even forcing Gothic parents to sell their children into slavery in exchange for food. The Goths rebelled. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, a Gothic army annihilated a Roman force and killed Emperor Valens himself. This was catastrophic. A barbarian army had destroyed a Roman emperor and his legions on Roman soil. The myth of Roman invincibility was shattered. Even worse, Rome couldn't drive the Goths out. The empire was forced to negotiate, granting them land and autonomy within Roman borders. For the first time, a foreign people had established themselves inside the empire not as conquered subjects, but as an independent power. The western and eastern halves of the empire had been growing apart for decades. The division was formalized in 395 CE when Emperor Theodosius died and split the empire between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This wasn't meant to be permanent, but it became so, and this division would seal the West's fate. The Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, was richer and more populous. It controlled the wealthy provinces of Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. It could afford to pay its armies, bribe its enemies, and maintain its defenses. The Western Empire, centered on Rome but increasingly governed from Ravenna, was poorer and weaker. It controlled territories that were harder to defend and less economically productive. When barbarian tribes came seeking entry or loot, the East often paid them to go west instead. The East survived by sacrificing the West. Between 405 and 410 CE, Italy was invaded repeatedly. First came the Ostrogoths under Radagaisus, then the Visigoths under Alaric. Rome's defenses were a joke. The city had grown soft, relying on its reputation rather than its walls. In 410 CE, for the first time in 800 years, Rome was sacked. Alaric's Visigoths breached the walls and spent 3 days looting the Eternal City. The psychological shock was immense. Jerome, a Christian scholar living in Bethlehem, wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." But Rome stumbled on. The Western Empire still existed, at least on paper. Emperors still sat on the throne, though increasingly they were children or puppets controlled by military strongmen. The real power lay with the generals, and those generals were often barbarians themselves. The Western Empire had become a hollow shell, maintaining the forms of Roman government while the substance drained away. In 455 CE, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals, who had crossed from Spain into North Africa and established their own kingdom based in Carthage. They sailed from Africa, captured Rome, and spent 2 weeks systematically looting everything of value. The term vandalism comes from this event. Rome, once the center of the world, had become a prize to be plundered at will. By the 460s, the Western Empire consisted of little more than Italy and a few scattered territories. Province after province had been lost, not necessarily conquered, but simply absorbed by barbarian kingdoms that had settled within Roman territory. Britain had been abandoned in 410. Gaul was divided among Franks, Burgundians, and Visigoths. Spain belonged to the Visigoths and Suevi. North Africa was Vandal territory. The empire was dying, but it wouldn't die quietly. The end came in 476 CE, but not with a bang. A barbarian general named Odoacer, who commanded what remained of the Italian army, decided he was tired of the charade. The current emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was a teenager, a puppet emperor installed by his father. Odoacer marched on Ravenna, deposed Romulus, and sent a message to the Eastern Emperor Zeno. The West no longer needed its own emperor. Odoacer would rule Italy as Zeno's representative. And just like that, it was over. No great battle, no siege, no heroic last stand. The Western Roman Empire simply ceased to exist because everyone agreed it no longer mattered. Romulus Augustulus was pensioned off to a villa in Campania. The last emperor of Rome retired in comfort. The date was September 4, 476 CE. But here's the thing. People living through this didn't necessarily realize they were witnessing the fall of Rome. Life continued. Cities still functioned. Laws were still enforced, though now by barbarian kings rather than Roman emperors. Many of these barbarian rulers actually tried to maintain Roman traditions because they understood that Roman civilization was valuable. Theodoric the Ostrogoth, who ruled Italy from 493 to 526, saw himself as a successor to Rome, not its destroyer. He preserved Roman laws, repaired Roman buildings, and employed Roman administrators. The fall of Rome wasn't a sudden apocalypse. It was a slow transformation, a gradual replacement of Roman institutions with barbarian ones, a mixing of cultures that would eventually become medieval Europe. But make no mistake, something profound had ended. The political unity of the Mediterranean world, established by Augustus and maintained for 500 years, was gone. The sophisticated urban culture of Rome gave way to a more rural, localized way of life. Literacy declined. Long-distance trade decreased. Cities shrank. The average person in 600 CE lived in a world that was smaller, poorer, and more dangerous than the world of 200 CE. So what really killed Rome? Was it the barbarians? In part, but remember, Rome had been fighting and defeating barbarians for centuries. Was it economic collapse? Certainly that played a role, but Rome had weathered economic crises before. Was it political instability? The endless parade of emperors, many lasting only months, certainly didn't help. Was it plague? Disease weakened the empire but didn't deliver the killing blow. The truth is, Rome died from all of these factors working together, each one reinforcing the others in a spiral of decline. The plague killed people, which hurt the economy, which meant less tax revenue, which meant the military couldn't be properly paid, which meant barbarians had to be recruited, which changed the character of the army, which made defending the borders harder, which invited more invasions, which hurt the economy further. It was a vicious cycle from which there was no escape. But there's a deeper answer, one that's uncomfortable to consider. Rome fell because Romans stopped believing in Rome. Somewhere along the way, the citizens of the empire lost faith in their institutions, their culture, their future. When faced with crushing taxes, they fled rather than fought. When offered a choice between Roman citizenship and barbarian protection, many chose the barbarians. When the empire needed soldiers, Romans refused to serve. When the barbarians came, instead of rallying to defend the eternal city, people shrugged and got on with their lives under new management. Rome didn't fall to stronger enemies. It fell because its own people gave up on it. The social contract between the state and its citizens broke down. The government demanded more and more while providing less and less. People responded by checking out, by becoming subjects rather than citizens, by surviving rather than thriving. And once that happened, once the psychological and emotional bonds that held the empire together dissolved, no amount of military force could save it. This is the shocking truth about Rome's fall. It wasn't killed by barbarians at the gates. It committed suicide. It died from within, hollowed out by centuries of mismanagement, corruption, inequality, and short-sighted decisions that prioritized immediate survival over long-term sustainability. The barbarians just delivered the final blow to a body that was already dead. And here's why this matters today. Look around at our modern world. We see many of the same warning signs that plagued late Rome, increasing economic inequality, crushing debt, a loss of faith in institutions, political polarization and instability, massive military expenditures that drain resources from domestic needs, a widening gap between rich and poor, a middle class under pressure. Sound familiar? History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. We can't predict the future by studying the past, but we can learn from it. Rome's fall teaches us that civilizations aren't destroyed by external enemies. They're destroyed by internal weaknesses that enemies merely exploit. It teaches us that economic inequality, political corruption, and loss of social cohesion are more dangerous than any army. It teaches us that citizens who lose faith in their society will not defend it when the crisis comes. Rome thought it was eternal. Every great civilization thinks it's eternal, but nothing lasts forever, not without constant effort, not without renewal, not without each generation recommitting to the values and institutions that made greatness possible in the first place. Rome forgot this. It became complacent. It assumed tomorrow would be like today. It was wrong. The fall of Rome is a warning across the centuries. It whispers to us from the ruins. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how advanced, no matter how eternal you seem, if you neglect the foundations of your society, if you let inequality grow unchecked, if you allow your people to lose faith, you will fall. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, inevitably, you will fall. The eternal city wasn't eternal after all, but its lessons can be, if we're wise enough to learn them. If you found this deep dive into one of history's greatest mysteries fascinating, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Neural Battlefields for more content that challenges how you think about history, warfare, and civilization. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think really killed Rome, or suggest other historical mysteries you'd like us to explore. Share this video with anyone who loves history or anyone who needs to understand that even the mightiest empires can fall. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, the past isn't dead. It's not even past.